All right, fellow truth seekers, cosmic travelers, this and that aficionados, we are back with Money Runs the World Part 3. And tonight we are going through a deep dive on Big Pharma, the opioid crisis, the COVID conspiracy, starting with the lab leak, and then detailing the possibility that it may have been manufactured. That's the Plannedemic theory. We're going to get into modern day slavery, cobalt red, and how the blood of the Congo powers our lives. Then get into planned obsolescence, from light bulbs to fossil fuels to healthcare to food, and finally to cancer cure cover-ups. We're going to get into the asset managers that run the world: Vanguard, BlackRock, State Street, aka the United BlackRock of Vanguard, and then finally we are going to get into Project Bluebeam, aka the fake alien invasion to facilitate the New World Order, which has long been the godfather of all conspiracies, dating back to Serge Monast and his very mysterious death in 1996 in Canada. So first, let's get into it. Big Pharma, opioid crisis, and the COVID conspiracy. First up, we got the opioid crisis, unmasking Big Pharma's role in fueling the epidemic. I did a final presentation for this in a political science class in school, and it is just insane. It's kind of a microcosm of COVID, and I guess kind of the ultimate example of Big Pharma. They knew exactly what was going to happen. They manufactured shit. They fabricated studies. They made America addicted to heroin in a pill. They wrecked countless lives. They killed hundreds of thousands, all for the moolah. And that's kind of the way Big Pharma works. That's the way the system works, which is why it's such a good example. So, the first chapter is the transition from war profiteers to legal drug dealers. Last episode, we talked about, how money runs the war machine. We went through a bunch of instances of the post 9/11 Middle East control system. A lot of those wars having been about oil, banking, defense contracts, regime change, and kind of creating this permanent instability in order to feed the system. But the same logic applies at home, because the empire does not only profit from foreign bodies in war zones, it profits from American bodies in the doctor's office, pharmacies, hospitals, rehab centers, and morgues. So the opioid crisis is one of the clearest examples in modern history of what happens when corporate profit becomes more important than human life. It was not a random drug epidemic. It was not people making bad choices. It was corporate greed that fueled a public health catastrophe. Big Pharma definitely created the demand. Doctors became the distribution network. The FDA provided this fake legitimacy, and American people paid the price. Over 500,000 Americans alone died from opioid crisis after just 1999. Companies like Purdue Pharma, Johnson & Johnson, Teva, and Endo made billions and billions from drugs they aggressively marketed while downplaying the addictionists. This is why it belongs in the money runs the world category, because it was not medicine, it was monetized addiction. So quick contents. This is from my presentation from college. I'll get into kind of more of my talking points for this, but just a little 190-second summary on what the opioid crisis really was. It was the most devastating public health crisis in recent American history, including COVID, 500K direct opioid deaths, and that doesn't even tell the full story because of the lasting effects, which we'll get into. The crisis was precipitated by an exponential increase in the prescription of opioid pain relievers, namely Oxycontin, driven in large part by misleading marketing tactics and it was more than just misleading marketing tactics. It was straight up lies. It was not just deception. It was fabrication. It was, lies dressed up in studies that weren't even true. Company execs fabricated data in order to support the fraudulent claim that these opioids were non-addictive. It was a clear case of profits over the well-being of the American public, and that tends to be a trend in the system we live in. The people that run the world really, they don't want people to be healthy and happy. They want to put us in a cycle of buying worthless things. Purdue Pharma, Jonathan, Richard, and Kathy Sackler are the main culprits in this instance. So let's get into the big lie, that less than 1% eventually get addicted. So the whole opioid empire obviously built on this most insane propaganda tricks in medical history. This 5-sentence letter published in the New England Journal of Medicine in 1980 claimed that addiction was extremely rare among hospitalized patients exposed to opioids. And so that tiny letter, this 5-sentence letter, not any sort of serious evidence, not even a real study, essentially became the golden page for the entire manufacturing and distribution of OxyContin and opioids at a large scale across the country. This crisis that killed over 500K and affected the lives of millions and millions literally stems from a 5-sentence letter. So pharma reps, medical schools, doctors, and execs use this to push the idea that opioids are safe. And so that's kind of the whole scam. They take an extremely weak piece of evidence, blow it up into industry gospel, repeat it until doctors believe it, convert that belief into prescriptions, bonuses, market share, and death. This is how propaganda works in the lab coats. So the Purdue family and the Sackler playbook. Jonathan Sackler probably deserves a life sentence for this. Obviously, he never served one day in jail. They didn't just sell OxyContin, they sold a myth. They told doctors pain was being undertreated. They pushed the idea of this fifth vital sign. They incentivized sales reps to flood vulnerable communities. They framed skeptics as cruel doctors, denying patients relief. And then when people became addicted, the company's answer was not moral reflection. It was more sales strategy. And that's why this is so evil, because, they were not accidentally poisoning people. They were watching numbers, watching addiction, watching the bodies pile up in real time and still pushing the machine forward as aggressively as they could. And worth noting, there is this consistent revolving door between the FDA and these big pharma companies, because obviously the government is more than just complicit in this crisis. They are a part of it. They're not just letting it happen, they're also profiting from it. Big Pharma could not have done this alone. The opioid crisis, not just a corporate scandal, it's a regulatory scandal, because the companies needed government legitimacy. They needed these labels, approvals, credibility, and institutional cover. And so we find this pattern of revolving doors everywhere. People move from government agencies into the companies they're supposed to regulate. Regulators become consultants, consultants to executives. Execs eventually become these policy influencers. And so one of the most infamous examples is Curtis Wright. He's the FDA official tied to OxyContin's approval language, who later went to work for Purdue. And so this is essentially a perfect example of what I call the iron triangle, industry regulators and political actors forming this self-protective ecosystem. And so one of my favorite pieces of media on the opioid crisis is the docu-series Dopesick. It shows this disturbing example of Curtis Wright, the FDA official responsible for this misleading label, who ends up joining Purdue as basically their prominent spokesman. So you have this FDA official that essentially is Purdue's prominent spokesman in the whole thing. One quote from Dopesick is, "They're forcing pharmacies to carry it with threats of lawsuits if they don't. The FDA is an unwitting co-conspirator, as they issued Purdue a warning label to say the drug is less addictive than other opioids when it's clearly not. The individual who produced this warning label now works for Purdue. His name is Curtis Wright." This is not public health, it's corporate capture. The FDA gives this fake stamp of legitimacy. Big Pharma prints the money and the public absorbs the damage. And so the next layer is even more sinister, because Big Pharma did not only market directly. There's the shadow groups, the pain societies, and essentially this de facto propaganda campaign that caused the deaths of hundreds and hundreds of thousands of Americans. And for you at home listening, this is probably going to be a little boring academic part compared to the more conspiratorial nature of this and that. But I wanted to include this in the Money Runs the World podcast, but you need to understand that this is, I use the word academic, but it's just a documented conspiracy, like so many other, quote unquote conspiracies. The only difference between a conspiracy and the truth is the passage of time. If you said that these Purdue Pharma, Big Pharma, and government officials knew what was going to happen and allowed hundreds of thousands of Americans to die, if you were saying that in the 90s and early 2000s, you'd be labeled crazy. But we all know that government and Big Pharma execs will willingly cause hundreds of thousands of Americans to die and get addicted to opioids. And they destroyed so many more lives that are not included in the death toll. So yeah, they fund these supposedly independent pain groups, medical societies, advocacy campaigns, educational programs, and professional organizations that all push the same message, that doctors are under-treating pain, opioids are safer than people think, addiction risk is low, prescribe more. They found these, what was called a pill mills. They would find these doctors who are willing to play ball and would just prescribe insane amounts of opioids to their patients and ruin their lives. And it's the de facto propaganda phase really is perfect because the most effective propaganda is not an ad. It's a medical guideline or a patient advocacy group. It's a nonprofit and it's quote unquote science, but behind the curtain, the same companies funding the same message that sells the same drug. That's how you manufacture consensus, not by winning the argument honestly, but by buying the institutions that decide what actually counts as truth. And so the crisis mutates because there are these pill mills where the street corner actually becomes the clinic. In the last Money Runs the World episode, we talked about, the CIA drug trafficking and the Iran-Contra affair, and, people like, Kill the Messenger, Jeremy Renner, aka Gary Webb, who exposed it, and, they killed him for exposing it. But the CIA was trafficking, cocaine across the globe and, turned Afghanistan into the opium production center of the world. But they're quite literally doing the same thing at home. They're just legalizing it and sending out fake studies and propagandizing the American public into, turning opioids legal, and then over prescribing the fuck out of them, convincing doctors, with obviously rewards of making more money if they, over prescribe their patients and kill society. So this is part of the Money Runs the World section because obviously, the CIA became this global drug trafficker, but, so did Big Pharma at home. When the CIA was trafficking drugs across the globe, they're doing it covertly and it's technically illegal, but, just know that the systems that run the world can do it illegally without you knowing and get away with it, but they can also just change up the laws, and distribute it, legally at home. Because once the supply is everywhere, the line between healthcare and drug trafficking collapses. Pill mills start popping up, clinics that hand out opioid prescriptions with little real medical oversight, and pharmacies move these massive volumes. Doctors get pressured, incentivized, or corrupted, and distributors look the other way. And so this is why calling Big Pharma legalized drug cartels lands so hard, because it literally is. A cartel creates demand, floods communities with addictive products, protects distribution channels, corrupts officials, and uses violence or legal intimidation to keep the money flowing. And Big Pharma does exactly that. Suits instead of street dealers, lobbyists instead of lookouts, FDA labels instead of burner phones, settlements instead of prison time. But the result was the same: addiction, death, destroyed families, and hollowed out towns. So when I tell you the people that run the world are dealing drugs on a massive scale, whether they do it covertly or they do it in your face by legalizing products that should be illegal, whether it's Big Pharma, whether it's intel agencies, the biggest drug cartels are Big Pharma and intelligence agencies in this world that we live in. So the three waves of this crisis as well. The opioid crisis was really just the first part of the wave, because it goes from the pills and the opioid crisis to heroin and now finally to fentanyl. It didn't stay in one form. It came in waves. The first wave was these prescription opioids, where doctors overprescribe, patients become dependent, pills flood communities. And the second wave is heroin, when prescriptions become harder to get or too expensive. These, so many addicted people, especially in the Midwest and poorer communities, move to cheaper street alternatives. So we talked about the CIA drug trafficking, especially in LA, and targeting black neighborhoods. And this was kind of the inverse of that, where kind of the white trash neighborhoods in the Midwest and the South kind of bit the bullet the hardest. And now the third wave has arrived in fentanyl, with synthetic opioids entering the supply and overdose deaths exploding. And so when you wonder why there's so many fentanyl deaths nowadays, a lot of people just try and blame China or the Mexican cartels, and I say there's reason to believe that the fentanyl in things like cocaine and other drugs is coming directly from potentially U.S. government adjacent organizations, i.e. Big Pharma in the U.S. And so when defenders say fentanyl is the real problem now, they're dodging the origin story, because it all trickles down from the opioid crisis and what happened in the late 1990s. Obviously, fentanyl is the monster at the end of the road, but Big Pharma helped build the road, and didn't just help build the road, it did build the road. And they turned pain treatment into addiction infrastructure, and then the black market takes off right where the legal market left off. And that's why the crisis is so devastating, because the original lie metastasized. And so the big point here is that settlements are not justice. The Sackler family, Purdue Pharma, people like Curtis Wright, who works at the FDA, they knew what they were doing the entire time. They willingly killed hundreds of thousands of people. The 9/11 hijackers killed 2,000 people, and the Purdue and the Sackler family killed 500,000 people. Just think about that for a second. And this is where the term money runs the world really comes in, because these companies paid billions in settlements. Purdue, Johnson & Johnson, Teva, and Endo, they paid massive legal penalties, but settlements are not justice. None of them ever spent a single day behind bars. And so for corporations making billions, fines become just a cost of doing business. Nobody says, we killed hundreds of thousands of people, so the executives should go to prison. Instead, they negotiate and restructure, and they settle. They protect the family money, and then they issue statements about moving forward, and they issue statements about DEI and protecting the environment. And it's crazy, because if you imagine a street dealer just causing one overdose, it's imagine 500,000x that. Who gets the longer sentence? The street dealer that they catch who had fentanyl in one bad batch, or the people that are billionaires and run the world and kill millions of people just for sport. It tells you everything about the class system, because poor people get prison, execs get settlements. It's not justice, it's aristocracy with paperwork. So the real solution is obviously, personal accountability. The answer is not just fines, it's individual criminal liability. Execs who knowingly mislead doctors, regulators, and patients should face prison time, not symbolic hearings, not corporate restructuring, prison. And this is obviously a common theme with the Money Runs the World section. I went over the Epstein episode a few weeks ago. No one's been in prison from the Epstein files. The names are names. We know who's fucked, who's raping little children, and they're not going to prison because they're rich. Ghislaine Maxwell, to this day, is the only one that went to prison. Bill Gates, Prince Andrew, they're posted up. P. Diddy barely even went. So go watch the Epstein files if you want to hear more names, and eventually getting to the Rothschilds and Rockefeller control system. But if the punishment is financial, the company calculates the risk, and if the punishment is personal, execs think twice. So when scandals like this happen, the only answer for them to not occur in the future is for people to go to jail. And because the opioid crisis happened, you'll note COVID is the next section. Because no one went to jail, the people that run the world, Big Pharma, government officials, the people that operate above government, i.e. Epstein type of networks, Bill Gates type of people, they get emboldened, and they realize that the worst thing that can happen to them if they get caught plotting COVID, planning the Plannedemic, that the worst thing is going to happen is they're just going to get hit with lawsuits. They're not going to go to jail. And so another big issue, which RFK has been very outspoken about in the past few years, is the peer review paradox, because the big pharma companies quite literally control the data. It's not an open scientific review process. The pharma companies control the data. They control who gets to see the data, and the public sees the polished manuscripts. They don't see the raw data. Doctors don't see the raw data. They see what is published behind closed doors, because the raw data, the real evidence, remains hidden, shaped, and selectively presented. And that's what the peer review paradox really is, because we think science is checking the company, but oftentimes it's the company that provides the fabricated science. So this means that the same corporation with a financial incentive to sell the drug also controls the evidence used to determine whether the drug is safe. That's not only insane, it's also illegal, and it's the system we live in. The opioid crisis only happened because these pharmaceutical giants were gatekeepers of the actual science. So one of the real reforms has to be mandatory transparency, raw clinical trial data, and adverse event data. Eventually, every corrupt corrupt system does have the same weakness, because someone inside eventually sees the truth and can expose it. So there needs to be more whistleblower protection, not just in Big Pharma, but in every corrupt system. Going back to my previous podcast episode when I touched on Truspiracies, the OpenAI engineer that could have flooded Altman and GPT and OpenAI in billion, maybe $1 trillion lawsuits because of how hard they're violating copyright law. And I'm sure copyright law was just the tip of the iceberg in the shit that they're violating. And he ends up dead in super mysterious ways, claims suicide. It's clearly not suicide. If you look into the Truspiracies case, he's another example of a long list of whistleblowers that have died in mysterious ways. And in that same episode, I touched on Danny Casolaro and the Octopus murders. He was blowing the whistle on the Promise software, and essentially Robert Maxwell stealing U.S. nuclear secrets with a bugged Israeli backdoor. He ends up dead in West Virginia with his files disappeared. Those are two of the most, I think, important examples of whistleblowers that died in super mysterious ways. Both of them were claimed suicide, and both of them were clearly not suicide. They were exposing corruption on a vast scale. And, Big Pharma is part of that system. From the Danny Casolaro case, it was surveillance systems and bugged Israeli software. The Truspiracies case was, artificial intelligence doing illegal things at a large scale. And now we have, people that have the opportunity to blow the whistle on, Big Pharma's nefarious tactics. But these insiders are trapped. NDAs, severance packages, legal threats, career destruction, retaliation, fear, and potentially murder if they do blow the whistle. And so in this docuseries Dopesick, which I think is the best example of the opioid crisis, the whole point is clear that prosecutors need someone inside Purdue to testify, because that's the only way that they can blow the case open. The only way to blow these cases open from Big Pharma to all these other tentacles within the octopus system is to get that insider, that whistleblower testimony. I'll cite the movie The Insider and the tobacco industry with Russell Crowe. That's just another example of the same system. They needed the insider to tell the people what's really going on, and then the government ends up buying out CBS. And if they air the segment on 60 Minutes that shows tobacco causes cancer, they're going to get sued into oblivion. And that's how the system works with these threats and buyouts. So if we want the truth, we need to understand that we need to protect the people who are going to expose it, whether it's Big Pharma, Big Tech, intelligence agencies, banks, defense contractors, Big Tobacco. The machinery of power depends on silence, and whistleblowers are the pressure points. That's why they're attacked. Cite Ed Snowden, cite Julian Assange. The whistleblowers are the people that are trying to advance humanity forward via transparency, but these systems thrive in secrecy. So what does the opioid crisis teach us? There's so many parallels to so many other of the big time topics I've discussed in just this Money Runs the World section. But it teaches us that in America, companies and industries will lie. They'll cause addiction, destroy, and kill as long as the profits are big enough and the victims are powerless enough. It teaches us that evil does not always look like a cartel boss or a warlord. Oftentimes, evil wears a suit, it sits on a pharmaceutical board, it speaks in medical mumbo-jumbo, it funds fraudulent pain societies, it gets fake, unwarranted FDA approval, and sometimes it pays a settlement and just walks away instead of going to jail. The opioid crisis was not just a tragedy, it is quite literally the business model of Big Pharma. And so once you understand the opioid crisis to its fullest extent, your mind becomes open enough to realize the possibility that COVID was a planned event. It is essentially, my thesis is that COVID was the opioid crisis evolved. As a business model built on pain, marketed through deception, protected by regulators, expanded by doctors, normalized by institutions, and it's paid for in American blood. And And this is why this is money runs the world, because when money becomes God, every institution becomes a temple for sacrifice. The war machine sacrifices soldiers and civilians. The oil machine sacrifices nations. The surveillance machine sacrifices privacy. The pharma machine sacrifices patients. And the people at the top call it growth, while the rest of us call it what it is. It's blood money. So yeah, can't recommend the docuseries Dope Sick enough. And also, I listened to John Abramson on Lex Friedman and then read a couple of his books. So Dope Sick and John Abramson were my big two, resources on the opioid crisis. All right, now Big Pharma Part 2. We just ran through the opioid crisis. Now we're going to get into COVID. So we're going to start with the fact that it was obviously a lab leak. The question is not whether it came from a lab. The question is, why was it being covered up so steadfastly? And then after we understand that it did come from a lab and it was being covered up aggressively, we are going to ponder the theory that COVID may have been planned. It may have been from Epstein type of networks, and it may have been manufactured, just like the opioid crisis. So we just saw how Big Pharma turned prescription pads into pipelines for addiction, with regulators looking the other way and the public paying in bodies. And this is the same architecture with a different chemical. Now we're going to zoom out to the ultimate information and power play. There's a virus that shuts down the planet, consolidates power even more into the few companies of the people that run the world. And so the question is not whether COVID came from a lab. The real question is, why did so many powerful people work so hard to bury that possibility from day one? So part one is the lab leak. I wrote my COVID dissertation, I believe, in 2021, when the lab leak theory was still viewed as a conspiracy by the mainstream. Look up the COVID lab leak on my Substack or on my website, thisandthatmedia.com. And I was absolutely astounded by what I found, because it just became so glaringly clear that it came from a lab, yet we were being told by Fauci and the mainstream that it came from a bat. So the lab leak is more than just probable. It's probably in the 99% estimation area. When you realize that the Wuhan Institute of Virology was literally the biggest coronavirus lab on Earth, studying different types of animal viruses, including the RATG13, which is 96% matched to SARS-CoV-2. So once you realize that the Wuhan Institute of Virology, the exact city where COVID originated from, was the biggest coronavirus lab on Earth, that alone is literally that's the only fact you need to understand that COVID came from a lab. That's it. Once you realize that the biggest COVID lab in the world is in Wuhan and that's where COVID came from, that's it. But gain-of-function research was happening there, making viruses more transmissible and virulent. The outbreak starts in Wuhan, the one city with a freezer full of COVID-like samples. The Batwoman Shi Li's own first instincts. This is the person that ran the Wuhan Institute of Virology, the main person in charge of the WIV, aka the Batwoman, quite literally said, "My instinct was that this did not come from a bat. This shouldn't happen in Wuhan. It probably came from our lab." And so no credible intermediate animal host ever found, and early cases had no market link. So one of my favorite analogies for the COVID lab leak conspiracy is from Jon Stewart. His quote in this paragraph, which I titled, "Maybe a cocoa bean mated with a steam shovel." So the lab leak hypothesis is valid, as this Wuhan lab was quite literally the epicenter of COVID samples. If the outbreak had happened in some other city where there was no lab with a freezer full of COVID samples, we wouldn't be having this conversation. But Wuhan is literally the epicenter of coronavirus samples on Earth. He then introduces a quote likening this situation to chocolate in Hershey Park, saying, "Oh my God, there's been an outbreak of chocolatey goodness near Hershey, Pennsylvania. What do you think happened? Oh, I don't know, maybe a steam shovel mated with a cocoa bean, or maybe it's the fucking chocolate factory." So Stewart here obviously suggesting if you're finding an outbreak of a chocolatey disease in Hershey Park, Pennsylvania, it probably came from the chocolate factory. And that is a perfect analogy to what happened with the biggest epidemic in modern history. This analogy obviously used to illustrate the logical reasoning behind considering the lab leak theory, given the WIV's focus on corona and its location. He then gets into the expert opinion of Shizing Li, aka the Batwoman, who made her career going into caves and getting COVID samples from bats so she could study them. She's the main person that runs the Wuhan lab. And so from the Batwoman's extensive study in this, she knows that it's actually South China where all the bats are and where SARS broke out in the early 2000s, not Wuhan, where COVID is most likely to jump from animals to humans. He notes that she never expected an animal to human transmission to happen in central China, and that her first thought was that the health officials got it wrong. She literally said right when COVID was happening, I think it came from our lab. It's either not coronavirus, or if it is, it probably came from our lab, not that it jumps from animals. So you had the person that ran the WIV, the Chinese woman scientist that's labeled the Batwoman, literally saying it came from the lab from day one. That story got buried so deep that the fact that the person that ran the lab said it most likely came from the lab from day one, when it took probably 3 years for the lab leak theory to become mainstream, is just shows you how good this system is at burying opinions that matter the most. So the overall synopsis of the COVID lab leak, if you're not convinced yet, when you combine the fact that the Wuhan Institute of Virology is quite literally the biggest COVID lab in the world, with prior reports of safety concerns and previous incidents at the lab, alongside the fact that the main WHO investigation led by the unambiguously biased Peter Daszak, so WHO investigation that determined it most likely came from an animal transmission at a wet market, was so fraudulent because the people that run the WHO and the Peter Daszak, the dude that headed that investigation, literally owned, I believe he owned the WIV, he owned the Wuhan Institute of Virology. He was directly implicated if people found out that it came from the lab. And he later admitted, people in the WHO admitted they did not even look into the lab leak hypothesis. So these people got the lab leak story buried because they didn't even consider it. They knew it was probable, but they didn't even look at the evidence because they knew if they did look at the evidence, it would become unambiguously true, and they would have to tell the public. So they didn't tell the public because they didn't look into it. And obviously you got the head researcher at the WIV claiming her instinct was that it came from their lab. And so when you combine the fact that the Wuhan Institute of Virology was quite literally the biggest COVID lab in the world, alongside the fact that the main WHO investigator and investigation, Peter Daszak, and the WHO's investigation of COVID was completely fraudulent, with the head of the WHO literally admitting that they didn't even look into the lab leak hypothesis, and the head researcher of the WIV, aka the Batwoman, claiming her instinct was that it came from the lab since day one, and that animal-human transmission would have occurred in southern China, not Wuhan. The answer becomes self-evident. COVID came from a lab. And so the real question about COVID and its origins was not whether it came from a lab. It's whether it's why was it being covered up. And the darker question, the real question about COVID, the only question that matters about COVID, it's not whether it came from a lab. It's, was it planned? Was this just like the opioid crisis? Was this a planned event? And we're going to get into some Epstein emails in a second that point to the possibility that it was. But the media's initial dismissal and censorship of the lab leak theory as misinformation raises alarming concerns about the narrative surrounding the pandemic. And this is such an important topic because literally Harvard and Ivy League and Stanford educated doctors were getting censored off of Twitter. They were getting banned on Twitter for saying COVID came from a lab in 2020. And if you remember that congressional hearing where Twitter execs were getting absolutely grilled, you realize that, like TikTok now, which is owned by Larry Ellison and essentially is an extension of the Israeli deep state in Israel, that's essentially what Twitter was in 2020. Before Elon bought Twitter, it was functioning as a a deep state network that censored the opinions of Harvard and Yale educated doctors, and Joe Rogan getting absolutely fried by the mainstream media for having literally, Ivy League doctors on his show talking about why, COVID likely came from a lab, and certain truths about COVID which were so violently suppressed in 2020 and 2021. So the immediate initial censorship of the lab leak theory as misinformation is super alarming, because now the FBI admitted it's true. And like I say so many times on the This and That podcast, the only difference between a conspiracy and the truth is very often the passage of time. So obviously there's so many parallels to the opioid crisis, where pharma companies play a significant role in creating and profiting from the epidemic. And it's, in my opinion, not unreasonable at all to consider this possibility that Big Pharma may have had a hand in creating, manufacturing the COVID pandemic. The potential for intentional creation or manipulation of the virus for financial gain, it simply cannot be ignored at this point in time. As we delve deeper into this issue, it becomes crucial to investigate the motivations behind the suppression of the lab leak theory, and to determine the extent of any potential involvement by pharma corporations, and beyond, aka the people operating above corporations, above government. The deep state, the shadow cabal, as I say so many times on the show, because the word cabal is truly the most apt term to characterize the people that run the reality we inhabit. The striking similarities between the opioid crisis and the COVID-19 pandemic in terms of media manipulation and corporate influence demand a thorough and transparent examination. And so only by unraveling the truth behind the origins of this global health crisis can we hope to prevent future catastrophes and hold those responsible accountable for their actions. Also worth noting, Muammar Gaddafi gave a UN warning in 2009, saying they're going to create a virus. Capitalist companies are going to produce viruses so they can generate and sell billions in profit. Prophetic or not, it captured the suspicion that many now feel. Gaddafi was literally calling this shit from almost exactly a decade before, saying that pharmaceutical capitalistic companies at some point in the future are going to create viruses so they can profit from the vaccines. Listen to Gaddafi, listen to RFK, realize that we are all living in a controlled psyop. Every panic is manufactured. Dating back to the Federal Reserve, the panic of 1907, the panics that create the centralized banking system, the global health pandemics, it's all manufactured to consolidate power, to control resources, and to profit and kill. And so lastly, I hypothesize that COVID was indeed a manufactured crisis, a planned plandemic, like so many people on the internet now using hashtag Plannedemic. It's becoming more and more clear that this was in all likelihood a planned event by the powers that be to consolidate crisis, to profit, and maybe for depopulation mechanisms as well. And so, obviously, I just drew some parallels to the opioid crisis. Both involve this money runs the world logic with massive profits, vaccines, lockdowns, pharma contracts, and of course power with increased surveillance, increased control, and emergency powers. And yeah, lab leak doesn't necessarily mean it was automatically a bioweapon, but it does mean that risky research with global stakes, that's exactly the kind of work that the octopus murders, the octopus conspiracy, using the octopus as a metaphor for the powers that be, and this is what they love: public-private fusion, plausible deniability, and suppressed dissent. And now, as the Epstein files are showing, there is a tangential connection to Epstein and his network. The Epstein files show pre-2020 discussions with Bill Gates, of course, one of the prominent pushers of the vaccine and the pandemic in general. Also worth noting that Boris Nikolic, I believe, who was the executor to Epstein's will, was literally Bill Gates' science advisor. So yes, you heard that correctly. The executor to Epstein's will was Bill Gates' science advisor. That's not proof of planning, but another thread in the elite networks that profit from and prepare for these events. Also worth noting, the late Trevor Moore, every few weeks, I learn about, a person who was, calling out the system for its corruption that met a mysterious end. Trevor Moore, a controversial comic who's known for his sketch work revolving on themes of secret societies and 9/11 inside jobs and moon landing hoaxes and calling out the Illuminati directly in his sketches. He died at just 40 years old in 2021 by falling off of his second-story balcony accidentally, is what they claim. Trevor Moore, a super controversial comic, just so happened to accidentally fall off his second-story balcony. God bless Trevor Moore. But there's literally an email in the Epstein files dated March 19, 2015 with this subject headline, "Preparing for Pandemics." I'm not sure if this one is to Bill Gates, but there was some correspondence with Bill Gates about pandemics. This email to Jeffrey Epstein literally says, "Please find attached a draft agenda for the meeting on preparing for pandemics as requested. Let's discuss next steps. For example, how to officially involve the WHO and ICRC. Best regards, and I hope we can pull this off." So yeah, Epstein is literally getting emails saying, "I hope we can pull this off," with the subject "preparing for pandemics." But yeah, the Trevor Moore theory was that Epstein's his death was essentially a kill switch for COVID. You'll note that right when Epstein dies, I believe August 2019 is literally when COVID happens. Again, I'm not trying to be Trevor Moore. I'm not trying to be Charlie Kirk. The martyr list goes on. So many names of people that have met their demise, whistleblowers, scientists. We are for sure living in a grand conspiracy. And I've said I'm willing to play ball before. I'll always say I am willing to play ball. I'll be an intelligence asset if need be. I'm not looking to join the list of martyrs, but when you know as much as I do at this point at such a young age, and you know we're thinking where I'm going with my podcasting and media career, I obviously can't help but be paranoid. But of course, my brand is centered around the quest for truth. They can't stop the quest for truth. No one can. The truth will set you free. But I guess overall, the COVID closer, we may never get a smoking gun proof. I don't know. People see Epstein's email with preparing for pandemics and people like Bill Gates involved in these discussions. That's actually why Bill Gates' wife divorced him, is because he was too close with Epstein. Pretty crazy. I believe that's quite literally why Melinda said this publicly. She divorced Bill because he's buddy-buddy with Jeffrey Epstein. People see that email and the facts. There's these coincidental facts, like the fact that his executor was the Bill Gates' science advisor. But the cover-up itself is the scandal. Why are scientists being silenced and censored off of Twitter? Why are they smearing the lab leak voices for years? Why are they rushing to this weak natural origin story? Why are they using someone like Anthony Fauci as a deep state plant? The fact that everyone in the world was listening to Fauci every single day of COVID when he was quite literally, there's no more accurate term than deep state plant. He's being paid to spread false narratives about COVID. Read RFK's book, absolutely grilling Fauci on the truth. But we realize that admitting this lab accident threatens billions in research funding, gain of function work, geopolitical alliances, and the entire biosecurity industrial complex. And you realize that COVID is this modern example of the octopus murders because it centers on viruses, data, fear, money, and control that are all entangled. And real accountability means transparent investigations, ending risky gain of function research without oversight, and breaking the revolving doors. And until then, the pattern continues. So when the next outbreak hits, ask yourself not just where the virus came from, but who benefits from what we're allowed to believe. Now with the hantavirus becoming the new next thing, and that's also literally mentioned in the X-Files movies from the 90s, makes me believe that we were kind of being programmed as a culture at events to happen retroactively. And so I guess to end this, the Big Pharma section of Money Runs the World, once you understand the truth and you do a deep dive on the opioid crisis, which I believe was the precursor to COVID, you start to see all the similarities between the opioid crisis and COVID. And then you see the current conspiracy that ended up coming true in the lab leak. It was dismissed and people were censored off the internet. When you realize that, Harvard educated doctors are being censored off the internet for giving their science-based facts, you can't help but wonder, why are people being censored? And if you know anything about psyops, you are in the middle of a psyop when there's a certain narrative that you're not even allowed to talk about. And then you combine these Epstein and Bill Gates type of networks, and you come to the conclusion that I have came to. COVID-19 was, in all likelihood, a deep state plot to garner massive profits, consolidate power, shut down small businesses, and allow companies like Amazon and Jeff Bezos, whose grandfather literally started DARPA, and people think that Bezos and Amazon is a DARPA cutout because his grandfather started DARPA and they gave him the funding. They chose him to be the one to start this company. And the same goes for Zuckerberg and Meta. I believe February 4th, 2004, the same exact day that LifeLog, the DARPA program to collect as much data on people as possible, same exact day, they don't even wait a day, is when Facebook launches as a company. So it's all fun and games. Bezos and Amazon and Meta, both likely essentially extensions of the government, and Epstein probably played a role in the creation of COVID. It's Big Pharma.